creating a sourdough starter? Have you ever wanted to create a sourdough starter, but you hear a lot of people explain it and get a little bit discouraged and think, maybe not? Well, I'm here to kind of help settle that out for you guys. I'm going to be explaining how to create your own sourdough starter and how the ins and outs work to kind of help you guys understand just a little bit more about how sourdough starters work so that way you can create your own at home and have sourdough loaves for the rest of your lives. I hope you guys enjoy this video and I hope you find it informational. I really enjoyed making it, and let's get on to the video. This is my starter, Voldemort. He is a living, thriving bacteria, which means probably by the end of this video, you're going to have a living, thriving bacteria as well. And in order to keep our sourdough starters thriving, we need to take care of them. So the first thing that I would like to mention is that the type of jars to use for your sourdough. Finding a good jar for your sourdough starter is important to continue to allow your sourdough starter to thrive. So I don't recommend using an airtight jar similar to the one I'm showing in the video, or anything that can be screwed on due to the fermenting process of your sourdough starter. It can cause it to not do what it's supposed to do and ferment properly, or worst case scenario, explode. I don't recommend using a jar without a lid because it can cause your sourdough starter to develop mold or dry out. Paper towels are a little iffy. If you change them out constantly or very regularly, it should be okay, but I still don't recommend it because it can cause your starter to dry out or even develop mold. What I usually like using for my sourdough starters is a jar with a loose fitting lid, such as a mason ball jar. They come with these types of lids, as you can see in the video. They sit very nicely on top of the jar and can be easily knocked off, especially if the sourdough were to grow out of the jar. I then set the screw part on top. It can be easily knocked off, so I don't have to worry about pressure building within the cans. Usually the rule of thumb when it comes to your sourdough starter containers is just don't use a tight fitting lid. One of the most difficult and frustrating decisions to make for your sourdough starter is choosing the right type of flour. In the video you see I'm holding bleached all-purpose flour. This is not the ideal flour for your sourdough starter because it lacks the minerals and nutrients to allow your starter to thrive. I like to use a mix of unbleached bread flour and unbleached whole wheat flour. Other people like to choose different flours like rye flour or even unbleached all-purpose flour. It is also worth to note to use 2 different kinds of flours in your sourdough starter. When it comes to your water, I suggest using purified water, spring water, or filtered tap water, and not distilled water because it lacks the proper minerals to help your starter thrive. Okay. There are some people out there who do make sourdough starters for people with celiac disease or gluten-free sourdough. I don't know how to do that, so I recommend finding a video if that's the kind of video you are looking for. This is not that video. We are going to be using normal flour. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. For the first part of this video, when I first created Voldemort up to probably about day 3, I did use a 1:1:1 ratio. However, as the days went on, I decided to do my own type of ratio. Now, in regards to sourdough, you want to think of it as starter, flour, water. Those are your ratios. So you want usually equal parts starter, flour, and water to go into your starter. Some people like to use a 1:2:2 ratio, which means 1 part starter, 2 parts flour, 2 parts water, which in layman terms usually means a little bit of starter and equal parts flour and water. So you can use 2 times more of the flour, 3 times more of the flour, and as long as you're around equaling the water, you should be fine. Again, I know it sounds a little bit discouraging, but once you start realizing how to feed your starter and all of that, you should be fine. Now, since we talked about flours, jars, and ratios, it's time to start our own sourdough starter. Go ahead and grab the type of flour you are wanting to use. I am using 3 tablespoons of unbleached bread flour, along with 3 tablespoons of unbleached whole wheat flour. Now, the different types of flours can cause a difference in density, gumminess when you create your sourdough loaf from your sourdough starter. So again, I would suggest doing research on the type of flours you are wanting to use to get the type of results you are looking for your sourdough loaves.
Now, I know I mentioned that you want equal parts flour, water, and starter, but I'm going to use a little less than 3 tablespoons of water to get my sourdough starter to a pancake batter like consistency. Usually, that's the rule of thumb when looking for the type of consistency for your sourdough starter, is doing a pancake batter or muffin batter type of consistency. Now go ahead and mix that up and make sure there's no flour clumps left over. If your sourdough starter is looking like mine, where it needs a little bit more water, go ahead and add a little bit more water until you get the pancake batter consistency you're looking for. This is where the workout begins, so this can be very tiring and it can hurt your arm. Just make sure you're stirring and scraping the sides to get everything well incorporated. And once you have a pancake batter like consistency similar to mine, you are done stirring and you can go ahead and wipe that down with a paper towel to make sure your jar stays nice and clean. Wiping down your jar is something that you're going to be doing every time you feed it, so it's good to get into this habit now. Once I'm done wiping down the walls of the jar, I like to put the lid back on to make sure no debris gets into the sourdough starter. And then I grab a Sharpie to write down the start date of my sourdough starter, the feed times, and the day that we are currently on. I suggest doing this if you are new to making starters.
So now we're going to explain feeding. Feeding seems a little bit weird, but essentially that's what you're doing. You are feeding the bacteria, the good bacteria within your sourdough. You're feeding it flour and water, and they're going to eat it, and your whole sourdough is going to rise and it's going to fall, and then you're going to have to feed it again.
Usually, when people hear feeding your sourdough starter, they are a little bit concerned, but essentially, that's what you're doing. Since this is a living bacteria, it does need nutrients to thrive. So, you want to take out about half or more than half of your sourdough starter, as you can see in the video, and then you want to feed it equal parts flour and water. For this part of the video, I did a little bit more flour than I usually do, as I mentioned before. I tend to look at my sourdough starter and see what it needs, and this time it needed a little bit more flour. So I did about 3.5 tablespoons of unbleached bread flour and 3.5 tablespoons of unbleached whole wheat flour. In this clip, you can see I have 1 part sourdough starter, 2 parts flour, and then I added some water. And then I went ahead and mixed that up to make sure there's no lumps or clumps anywhere, scraping down the sides. And when I'm finished, I wipe down the jar with a paper towel to make sure it's clean. And then I put my dates and times on it. Essentially, this is just what feeding is.
So now you're probably thinking, what do I do with the leftover discard? Do I toss it? Can I use it? What can you do? So for the first week or so, you don't really want to use this discard. Some people do. I am a little bit health conscious, so I know that it's still developing its good bacteria, and there's probably some bad bacteria within the discard for the first week. So I tend to throw that discard out. Please do not throw your discard down your sink. It can ruin the pipes very easily. You want to discard most of it into the trash, and then stuff like on your spoon or in a bowl that you use, if you soak it in hot soapy water, it should dilute it enough for you to throw it down, your sink. But I would not be throwing all of your discard into your sink. Please throw it away so that way you don't ruin the pipes of your house. After the first week, people start to save their discard because the discard can be used for different things, such as bagels, pancakes, other types of bread. It can be used. Some people tend to use it to make sourdough loaves, even though it's not necessarily recommended because you're not going to get a great loaf from that. But you can. You can use this discard instead of tossing it out after the first week.
So, like you can see in this clip, you guys might run into something called a false rise. A false rise is your sourdough starter rising in the jar and then falling again on day 2 or 3. This is not ready to bake with, it is just showing you that the good bacteria is doing its job.
As the time goes on, you're going to notice that your sourdough starter is going to get very bubbly. And if you are marking where you fed your starter, you're going to notice that it's starting to grow past the line that you marked. And this is good. You want your sourdough to rise and fall. You don't want it to stay stagnant where it's at. You want it to grow and you want it to fall back down. Now, some people, some of their sourdough starters are overachievers and they tend to grow outside of the jar. Some of them, if you feed it decently at a decent height, sometimes they don't grow out of the jar and they still stay in their little happy place. Now, some of you are wondering, how do I know when my sourdough starter is ready to use? Usually, people tend to not focus on the float test because the float test can trick you into thinking that your sourdough starter is ready to be baked when it's not. So, usually, people tend to go for the rise and fall rule, which is usually you want your sourdough starter to rise and fall within 6 hours for about 3 to 4 days straight, and then around that time, you should be able to bake with it. It may not be a very strong starter, but it's ready to be baked with. Now, temperature can play a huge part when it comes to the rise and fall of your sourdough starter and the health of your sourdough starter. If you live in a colder environment, it might take a little bit longer for your sourdough starter to rise and fall. If you live in a warmer environment, it might take a shorter time for it to rise and fall. So you want to find a good consistency or a good temperature to keep it at a minimum where you don't want it to rise and fall too quickly or take too long to do so. Usually, the temperature for most people, depending on their climate and their elevation, tends to be around 75 to 80 degrees. One of the biggest issues we see with trying to control the temperature of the sourdough starter is people leaving their sourdough starters in the oven, and then a family member or themselves forgetting that their starter is in the oven, and they turn on their oven and then they have killed their sourdough starter. So if you're new to the sourdough starter game, I really do not suggest putting your sourdough starter in the oven. I tend to remind myself a lot of my sourdough starter. I check on him a lot, and I have a sign on my oven stating that my sourdough starter is in the oven so nobody turns it on accidentally. That is one way to bypass that. My house runs very cold. We do not have a heating system, and then in the summer we have it running very hot. So typically in the winter I keep my sourdough starter in the oven with the light on, and then in the summertime I try to keep it in the fridge most of the time if I'm not baking with it very often. So now this is where it's going to get to a little bit of a gross part. Your sourdough starter is going to smell, especially after maybe the second, third day. You're gonna get a acidic type stinky smell that is normal. Now, if it smells like vomit or worse, it has gone bad and you probably have to restart. You want it to smell a little acidic-y, a little bit yeasty, but not where you're completely gagging. But at the same time, some people are also sensitive to smells, so just be very mindful that even though it might smell a little weird, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has fully went bad. The other thing that I would like to mention when it comes to sourdough starters is that it can develop mold. Now, the mold on your sourdough starter is going to look a little bit different than mold you would see on other foods. Um, Usually, if you see pink, orange, blue types of streaks within your sourdough starter, that is mold. Do not bake with that. Do not eat it. Throw it out and then disinfect your jar immediately, and then you can start again. Sometimes you will see some fuzzy, not fuzzy, but you'll see some kind of mold growth on the top of your starter. Throw it out, disinfect your jar, same thing. Usually, the rule of thumb when it comes to sourdough starters is when in doubt, throw it out. So if you think it looks weird, smells weird, throw it out and start again. It's completely okay. I also realized that when it comes to whole wheat flour, it can trick you in thinking that there are orange streaks in your sourdough. With the pink and orange streaks, they're a lot more noticeable than the little orange tints you're going to see with the whole wheat flour, so just keep that in mind. So you're probably wondering, okay, you said first week, how long does it take for a sourdough starter to be established? Usually how you know your sourdough starter is ready to be baked with is that it will rise and fall within 6 to 8 hours for about 3 to 4 days straight. After that point, it will continue every time you feed it. It will continue to rise and fall as long as it's not in the refrigerator. If you put it in the refrigerator, it will stunt the growth or stop, or basically it's like hitting a pause button. So you can have it all the way to the top of your jar and stick it into the refrigerator, and it's going to hit the pause button, and it may not fall down as fast. I do not suggest throwing it into the refrigerator until it's established. I hope you guys found this video very informational. If you guys need more explanations on things, just let me know. Maybe I can create a different video. I really hope to turn this into a type of series where we can learn how to make sourdough starters together, learn how to make loaves together, and do some experimenting. I think that would be so much fun. I hope you guys learned some things from this video. I definitely learned a lot from just my second sourdough starter. So Me and Voldemort wish you guys luck, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. See you guys in the next video. Bye.